Today, I'm really excited to share a special project with you, a painting from a 115-year-old photo. I thought I'd share some technical aspects of how I work from an old photo and what painting techniques I use, but I also just want to share the story of this photo that the painting comes from. So, this is a particularly special project for me because this is a commission by my great aunt, and it's of her mother, my great grandmother. She was born in 1900 and lived until 2001, and this photo was taken around 1905. Her family lived in a town about 20 miles outside of the state capital, which is where this picture was taken. So they made the trip in a horse and buggy, and the trip, which now probably would have taken no more than an hour or so, probably took the whole day. She had new shoes for the occasion, and she wore them on the entire horse and buggy ride. But by the time they had walked from the buggy to the photographer studio, she was just done. I don't recall if her feet were blistered, but her new, not broken in shoes hurt, and she refused to wear them anymore. And her father, whom I'm told had some trouble telling her no, let her take the photo barefoot. I know you can't see from the image that I'm putting on the screen here, but the photo I'm working from is remarkably small. I don't know enough about photography to say what technology was probably used to make this, but I believe the photo itself was smaller than a 3x5 card. In addition to the inherent value of having an oil painting to hang in your home, especially a custom painting like this one, by turning this photo into a painting, we can have a piece that's large enough to sit over a mantle without any degradation associated with enlarging the photo. All I needed was to take a good photo of the photo itself, and then I could return it to its owner, and I had all that I needed to start painting. I find that it's better to work off a digital image in general, but especially in a case like this too. With a digital image, I can zoom in, I can experiment with Photoshop regarding any edits I want to make, and I never have to worry about damaging a precious physical copy of a photo like this one. So I spoke at length in my last video about how I work with black and white photography to translate that into a painting. I'll link the video in the upper right-hand corner as well as the description if you'd like to hear about that in greater detail. But for this video, what I will say is that old photography like this is perfect for a monochromatic painting. You don't have to worry about colorizing the photo and making it believable. You can honor the original style of the photo while breathing even more life into it through subtle variations of tone and texture. So even though this is a monochromatic piece, I actually have several colors that are making this particular painting possible. So for my palette, I have a combination of the following colors: Winsor & Newton Terra Rosa, Winsor & Newton Yellow Ochre Pale, Rembrandt Transparent Oxides Yellow, Brown, and Red, and then Rembrandt Viridian to create variations in the tone or saturation of all of those warm red colors that I mentioned above. As I go through the block-in of the painting, you can see that I focused a lot of the transparent oxide yellow, yellow ochre, and viridian into the background, particularly on the right-hand side. Then I tried to reserve Terra Rosa, which is a very pink earth tone, actually, for her skin tone to give it some warmth and this feeling that even though I'm not going full color, that the tones reflect what you might expect to see in real life. Then I used transparent oxides red and brown for my darkest darks and the details of the chair that she's sitting on. Now, I explain in depth in that previous video why exactly I'm not colorizing this image. Aside from what I said before about it just not being necessary to create a beautiful picture, colorizing something is incredibly difficult, and even really skilled artists who specialize in this struggle to replicate something that feels as real as a painting or a color photograph would today. So, my priority is to create the most beautiful image that I can. And so, for me, that means not sacrificing anything by trying to push the color without having any kind of reference to guide me through. That being said, if you do want to hear more about exactly why I do not colorize black and white photography, be sure to check out that previous video because I really go in depth there. Now, going back to my palette, like in that previous video, I am not using any white here. So I'm instead using solvent like Gamsol or even acetone to erase back to the white of my lead primed panel. Now on day 1, this is very easy to do with Gamsol because all of the paint is still wet. And you can see this in this early portion of this video. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to complete the painting in a single day, so I had to resort to a much stronger solvent, acetone, in subsequent sittings when I needed to erase parts of the paint layer that had already begun to seriously dry. Now, whether I'm using Gamsol or acetone, the process here is pretty much the same. So to erase with either one, I simply dip a clean brush in the solvent and then scrub on the painting until the paint begins to lift away. That being said, on day 1, I can do this super easily with Gamsol, but on day 2, even with acetone, it's pretty tedious. Not to mention the acetone is harder on my brushes and produces pretty strong fumes. If you want to try something like this, I would recommend that you only use acetone in a very well ventilated studio or outside. And I'm routinely capping my tiny jar of acetone whenever I'm not dipping into it for that reason. Now you may wonder why I don't go to a middle ground solvent between Gamsol and acetone, something like actual turpentine. What I've found from experimenting with this method on previous paintings, paintings you haven't seen on this channel because they did not work, is that if I need to go to something stronger than Gamsol, typically I do just have to go all the way to acetone. There's not a whole lot of forgiveness once the paint is beginning to dry, so short of using some kind of physical abrasive, acetone is unfortunately the only thing I can really depend on to work. And I would rather not be just dumping solvent on the painting, hoping that it will work. After all, turpentine has its own fume issues, so even though it's not as pungent as acetone, it probably wouldn't behoove me to even bother going down that road at this point. That being said, the method I'm borrowing from here is Richard Schmid's monochrome approach that he shares in his book Alla Prima 2. In it, he talks about the use of Gamsol and acetone to erase, but he does also mention abrasive tools that I don't wind up using here, namely something like steel wool. If you're interested in seeing the beautiful paintings that Schmid produces, as well as just getting more detail on his materials and methods for monochrome paintings, I'm linking to Alla Prima 2 in the description because it honestly is the modern painting Bible. Not to mention, if you are watching this around the time that this video goes live, I did just get a message from the Schmid team who runs the press that produces Alla Prima, and they are still shipping books. So if you need some amazing reading to keep you company right now, this is a fantastic resource that you should look into if you have not already. So as I watch back through the footage, I can't help but think that if I were working on this painting today, having the benefit of hindsight, I probably would have done the following. I probably would have blocked out an entire day really aggressively, like having my meals pre-prepped and having literally nothing else on my to-do list for the day. No social media posts, no checking email, literally nothing but this painting. I would have begun as soon as I had eaten breakfast, which preferably would have been something large and filling so that I wouldn't have to stop for a while. And if I had done all of that, I perhaps could have been finished by the end of the day. And here's why that matters. Like I mentioned earlier, it was so much easier to erase out that paint before it had begun to really dry. So for me, that meant I had all of this flexibility on day one that I couldn't really get back at all on subsequent days. So if I possibly could have rearranged my schedule so that I just didn't have to extend into anything beyond day one, my life probably would have been a great deal easier, and I probably actually would have saved time on the painting as well. I think in terms of total hours worked on this piece, I could have achieved start to finish in one day, or at least come close enough to be a really big help. But instead, I hit a wall and had to split this up over several days. Thankfully, the painting was about as workable on day 4 or so as it was on day 2, but nonetheless, I would really strongly recommend that you block off a single day for projects like this one if you want to try monochromatic paintings for yourself. I will throw in a quick disclaimer here. This is not the only kind of monochromatic painting, so if you want to have white on your palette and you aren't really concerned about the transparency, you just want to be able to focus solely on value and not deal with hue or chroma, this absolutely would not apply. So this time limit or the value of rearranging your schedule so that you can work uninterrupted on a piece like this comes from the fact that you're trying to work transparently and you only have access to the white of your panel. So if you do have white on your palette, do not feel the need to work any more quickly than you usually would. I just want to point this out in case you do want to try this transparent method of monochromatic painting that Richard Schmid uses. On that note, I also found with this method that I had to totally redo whole sections rather than making slight adjustments. I mentioned this in the previous video as well, that working with thin down paint on a really slick surface like this, which is necessary to help you achieve that transparency and give you as much working time as possible, the paint is just harder to control. It feels finicky, like a completely different beast than other oil paintings, and definitely a different beast than something really absorbent like watercolor or gouache. The paint is really prone to just stop cooperating altogether if you try to overwork it. So rather than taking something that needed a slight adjustment and trying to implement that adjustment, it usually just made more sense to wipe all of the paint off of that section and start over. You'll see this several times as I work on her legs, which are one of the largest, most simplified shapes in the piece. So achieving the appropriate gradient on there and getting accurate light and shadow shapes that don't feel too abrupt, it was really challenging, and I must have tried it 4 or 5 different times before I finally got something I was happy with. That being said, thankfully, this did not happen while painting her face, which I'm very, very grateful for. Another notable characteristic here is a big difference between this and full color paintings. So there's virtually no impasto here. Everything is done super, super thin to allow that transparency to come through. It also helps with erasability down the line. For that reason, with a big painting like this, I opted to create a custom ground, which had quite a good bit of texture, which you'll see when we get to the varnishing steps. That way, there's a lot of visual interest, especially in large, kind of abstracted, simplified areas, like particularly the background. You get a whole lot of interest there that you probably wouldn't have been able to achieve otherwise. Now, you might recall that in the previous piece, I wasn't working on a lead primed surface with a lot of texture like this one. Instead, I was working on linen, which has a very different surface texture all of its own. That was perfect for the 8 by 10 size of that particular piece, but working larger here, I had a feeling that the texture and the weave of a linen just wouldn't quite be enough. So this might be something to keep in mind for your own pieces if you want to try something like this. It really pays dividends to be strategic about when you choose a custom ground versus when you opt for something like a more regular linen weave. In general, I tend to prefer linen for things like portraiture and stick to custom textures when I'm doing something like a floral or maybe a plein air painting, but this is a great example that shows that the exception proves the rule. I suspect that as long as you're mindful, though, about why you're choosing one ground versus the other, you're going to produce something you're pleased with. Now, as I'm watching back through the footage, I'm thinking about something that I mentioned in my last video, which is that ideally I could go out of my way to reserve some of the light areas, but the truth is that even if I had, I would probably still have needed to erase, and I probably would have gone into several days, and it probably still kind of would have been a small headache. Instead, it felt more intuitive in the moment, and I think now too, in hindsight, to at least guess at some of the smaller shapes and be able to check them rather than staying more tentative in the hopes that it would mean that I didn't have to erase after day one. I do think this is an interesting question, though, and I think as I go forward and do more pieces like this, I'm really interested to see if that's something I can start to implement, or if instead I'm just going to get really good at being able to work out an entire piece start to finish in one sitting. I think that that's absolutely a skill in and of itself because painting is extremely taxing. It's taxing in terms of our concentration, but it's also taxing just visually. When we're aspiring to create a painting that is at once realistic and expressive and with areas of abstraction, we're having to do a whole lot of processing mentally. We're asking ourselves what shape of paint to put down and where it needs to go and how big it needs to be and what the value should be. And if we're working in color, we're having to ask what color something is or how chromatic is it. Not to mention things like, what is the edge quality of the object I'm painting? Does this edge need to be lost or softened, or does it need to be hard? You also get into questions of how abstract a certain item should really become in order to aid your composition. When you put all of these things together, you wind up asking yourself, between 6 or 10 questions every time you put your brush down on your canvas. Daniel Keyes likens this to the concentration you would need to perform brain surgery, and actually had a student in one of his workshops who was a surgeon basically corroborate that theory. For that reason, I try to be really forgiving with myself in terms of needing to take breaks or shift between pieces. And that's kind of only half the story. So, aside from the decision making side of things, our eyes also get kind of desensitized to what we're looking at after we stare for a certain amount of time. It's why after you've been painting on something for several hours, it just feels like you can't see it anymore. You can't see what's wrong. Our eyes actually zero in and sharpen to the point where it will warp what you're looking at in your painting to match what you're looking at in the reference, so that you can't figure out what you need to do anymore. In my own practice, I try to combat this by kind of rapidly cycling through pieces. So as soon as I sense myself getting kind of dead to the piece visually, where I just can't see it anymore, that's usually when I rotate in a piece that I haven't looked at in a while. Or when my attention span is just shot, that's when I know it's time to take a break, because running any kind of business, you know, not least of all an art business, there's plenty of other things I can be doing. The last thing I want to be doing is painting at half capacity. Instead, I really should be prioritizing the whole day so that I know that I'm going to be at peak performance and peak energy when it's time to sit down and paint. And by the time that energy begins to wane, I know that's when I have to cut myself off. I think this is particularly hard in workshops, or if you're ever at a group painting session with a model, or heck, even if you have a model that you've hired just for yourself, there is immense pressure to stick to the schedules that have been assigned to you, either because that's when the workshop is in session and that's when you're getting critiqued, or that's when the model is taking the model stand, or that you only have 5 minutes left with the model before they have to go home, and you feel that pressure to get down as much as you possibly can. I find this is when everyone, not just myself, is most likely to start panicking and making poor decisions in a painting. Granted, I think I have a lot of room to improve my attention span, but I'm also the first person who will just totally sit out a session when the model is taking the stand, because I know that I'm not going to actually improve the painting in that time, and that I need to give my eyes a break and I need to give my brain a break. Ideally, I hope I can kind of strengthen those two muscles side by side. The muscle of helping my own attention span, but also the muscle of not giving in to that pressure. The pressure that leads to probably a whole lot of paintings we're not exactly proud of. Now, going back to the painting, one thing I did want to note is that I'm using my brushes just a little bit differently than I normally do. I have a recent video in which I talk about some of my most frequently asked questions, including the brushes that I use. And while I'm using all of the same brushes in this painting, I'm kind of prioritizing them a little bit differently. So to put down paint, I am relying quite a bit on the Rosemary Eclipse Extra Long Combers, just because they create kind of an interesting organic texture with each brush stroke. But for erasing, this is where I'm busting out brushes that I don't usually use. So I have a couple of ivory brushes from Rosemary. I believe I have a larger ivory long flat, and then I have an ivory, I think it's called a pointed round, that is a teensy brush that I'm using mainly for detail work around her eyes. So these are stiffer synthetic bristle brushes that do really well in terms of like pressing those solvents into my panel to erase paint layers. In addition to the ivory brushes, I have some evergreen flats. These are the same kind of bristle, but they've been treated with a dye that makes them just a little bit softer. But I find that they are really good at holding a very crisp edge. So I'm kind of going back and forth, partially just depending on the size that I need, but also the degree of precision that I need. And I'm really leveraging these stiffer synthetic bristle brushes to really help me out with the erasing. If I tried to use one of the Eclipse combers for this, or one of the Master's Choice, which I don't think you see me use very much here in this particular painting, they just aren't stiff enough to really scrub that paint off of the panel like I need for it to. Similarly, this painting is really a great illustration of why I don't recommend specific brush sizes. So your brush size really depends on the size of painting that you work on. So when I'm in the early stages of this, I'm using some of the biggest brushes I have just to lay in that background, establish that beginning tone for the piece, and just get ground covered. Now, when I start to get into her face, I'm actually using some of the smallest brushes I have. So it really is just a matter of using the right size brush for the job. To put this in perspective, I think the largest brush sizes I have in my kit are between size 14 and 18. And then the smallest brushes I have are like 00, I think. So as far as I'm aware, this is pretty much the gamut unless you start buying like big old brushes from like the hardware store rather than the art supply store. So as I watch back through the footage now, I'm really seeing a lot of sort of the practices that I've already described. I'm kind of having to go back wholesale and lift color out of areas like her arms and her hands. And take out as much pigment as I can, and then very carefully come back and bring that pigment back in. I'm also doing a little bit of work on my edges, just finding places where it's off of where I want by just a few millimeters, and I can really begin to clean that up and get it just really solidified so that I do not have to think about the drawing anymore, and I'm really moving into finishing touches territory. I'm also beginning what's like it once kind of a tedious process, but also a somewhat soothing one, which is to work on the chair that she's sitting on. As you're beginning to see, it's really this ornate, beautiful wicker. It's almost like a sleigh. I wish I could see the rest of the chair, but the photo I showed you at the beginning is all that we have. There is no larger photo that shows more of what she was sitting on. But either way, this is kind of an intimidating part of the painting because it's really geometric, it's really precise, but it's also incredibly repetitive. And as a painter, my brain kind of hates that. That's where I tend to be prone to more mistakes because I'm looking for the pattern and I'm just trying to implement the pattern. And I'm not a painting robot. I'm much more inclined to see the intricacies of someone's face than I am to be able to paint architecture, for instance, which is probably the last thing you're going to see me paint on this channel. Perhaps one day I'm going to get there, but that's how you know that I really wanted to go outside my comfort zone. That being said, the great thing about all of these details on the chair is that, I don't have to worry as much. I have the likeness down. I'm really at the finishing touches stage of everything to do with her, including her dress. So now it's just for the supporting players. It doesn't have to have the same level of tightness or finish as she does. And there's some room for interpretation here, so it doesn't have to be as perfect in order to capture a likeness. So I can kind of just chill out and kind of go back and forth between the painting and my drawing and slowly, bring the details of the chair in. As I do this, I also begin to make one final shift that's really going to pull the entire piece together, which is to really take a look at the overall values, the largest shapes of values, that is, that are making this piece work. So I very quickly take a very large part of the background and darken it, and that's going to help the chair really pop, and it's also going to mean that I don't have to go into as much detail for it to look real, because suddenly I'm making the value portion of this formula work. I think that's also kind of the magical point at which she really starts to come off the page because her dress is so light and bright, and the same thing with her face. Darkening that background really helps her to come forward, and this is when I'm beginning to feel like we're really there. It's not often that I have such a compressed timeline on which to complete a painting. This painting, like any other commission, I build in quite a bit of time for them, but regardless of my agreement with the client, it's not about that deadline. It's about I only have so long before the painting literally will not let me work on it anymore. Um, and that kind of brings with it its own sort of exhaustion. When I was working on the portrait of the little girl in the chair that I shared in my video on quitting my job and going full time as a painter, I kind of was able to marathon that piece so successfully because there was a deadline for it. I was submitting it for a competition that I had not been planning on submitting to, and it just turned out that I only had about 5 days in which to do it. This, on the other hand, I had the same amount of time, but I didn't have that external incentive of something really exciting like a competition. It was just kind of this like existential dread of what's going to happen when this painting goes on for too long. So at this stage, I'm beginning to feel a profound sense of excitement and relief, that I feel like I can see the finish line. My final steps here, aside from implementing any changes or adjustments that the client requested, is really just to start standing back from the painting a great deal and worrying a little bit less about how good it looks compared to my reference, and simply looking for what is distracting me. So I'm seeing a lot of that with the chair, just because there's just so much visual information there. It has the potential to be a really busy part of the painting. So I'm going through and I'm looking at what I can kind of knock down, what is reading more as a painting and less as like a painted interpretation of a real thing, if that makes sense. Just places where you can't really suspend your disbelief and the brushwork is becoming distracting rather than contributing to the whole. At this point, my final touches really come down to looking at some of the more subtle detail of the chair and trying to figure out how to kind of suggest it or evoke it without literally painting individual strands. Is it strands of wicker? Is that like what wicker is? Anyway, without having to paint individual pieces of the chair. So I'm going through and just trying to kind of squint really hard at the photo and try my best guess at what could evoke that pattern. This is a place where using the blur tool on the digital copy of the reference can really help, but there's a fair bit of just trial and error here that's kind of getting me through this portion. I will say in this particular case, it's actually really helpful to take this approach because if I were to literally take a look at kind of the formula of how all of these strands are wrapping and I try and go piece by piece, it's not going to look particularly real. There are places in the photograph where the detail gets totally lost, and so trying to be sensitive to that and curating which details we show and which we don't winds up making a really big difference in the long term. And last but not least, I'm making some finishing touches on her feet, which are, I think, kind of a secretly tricky portion of this painting because so much of the story is about why she's barefoot for this image she's posing for. So I want it to kind of come out, but I don't obviously want it to compete with her face or her expression. So I'm really trying to be mindful of kind of capturing the realism of them without making them stand out too much, which I think is a natural tendency that we're prone to in painting. Is the more we pay attention to something to try and correct something or make sure a specific thing is coming across for that portion of the painting, the more that portion of the painting is going to stand out, whether we want it to or not. So I'm trying to, step back as much as I can from it and evaluate as even-handedly as I can at this point to see if it's working and what maybe needs to be toned down. All right, and now we are on to the exciting part for a lot of people, but I think it's like an objectively exciting part of any painting, which is seeing the varnish go on. A lot of this painting is really, really matte since it's been thinned down so much with solvent, and putting the in this case, this is Gamvar gloss, that's the varnish I'm using. Putting this varnish on really helps the painting to kind of capture that translucency and that glow that we saw in the very early stages when everything was still wet. Now, because like I mentioned before, the painting is so thin, that is to say the paint layer is so thin, it barely took any time for it to be ready for varnish. That being said, given that I had so much erasing with acetone going on, I kind of just wanted to play everything safe. So acetone actually should dry the fastest of any solvent, but still, it's just such a delicate process that I didn't want to risk anything that I did not absolutely need to. So I still gave this several days before I even considered varnishing, and before actually getting the varnish out, what I did was gently touch over the entirety of the painting, not smearing, but just patting such that if any of the paint were wet, I would not smear any of that paint. And assuming that everything came up totally clean, I didn't see any pigment come up on my fingertips, then I might kind of examine it a little bit more closely just to be sure, but that's the indicator that I use that it's okay to go ahead and varnish. Interestingly, I actually had some issues with the varnish beading up on this painting. Typically, that would happen for two reasons. One is that too much varnish was applied to a given area of the painting in one go. And two is that sometimes the paints and the primers can have an impact on whether the varnish just tries to bead up or not, which is like somewhat out of your control. You usually do not know if that reaction is going to happen before you use something for the first time. In my case, though, I've been using all of the same paints for so long that I'm pretty sure the culprit was simply due to pouring enough varnish on the painting to cover the whole piece, and then spreading it across the whole painting. So what I'm trying to say there is I poured on enough varnish to cover the whole painting, but when it first went on, it was all pooling in one area, which is what encourages that varnish to bead up. So the more I spread it across the painting, the less the beading becomes an issue. Nonetheless, to combat the beading, anywhere where the varnish just doesn't want to apply evenly like you would want it to, I'm just gently scrubbing with my varnish brush here, and that's pretty much getting it to where it needs to go. By the time the varnish is fully covering the entire painting, at this point it's thin enough such that it's not beading up anymore, and I'm pretty much good to go. Now, occasionally I get questions about what exactly the varnish is doing and why I'm applying it. So the varnish is intended to, first and foremost, protect the paint layer. It's literally a physical barrier between the paint and the outside world. Some types of varnish can even protect against UV influence on the paint, which can adversely affect some pigments over time, whether that's 5 years or 500 years. But it's also just a physical barrier against debris in the air or smoke or pollution or I don't know, anything else that could potentially dirty up a painting. But on top of that, particularly with gloss varnishes are great at bringing luminosity back to darker areas of paint that tend to dull out and look kind of matte, like part of your painting has glare, but only parts of it where the painting is really dark. Personally, I love really rich, dark colors, so I always opt to varnish my pieces, and I always opt for a gloss varnish. And hopefully this goes without saying at this point, but the reason that I can apply this and I don't have to worry about it smudging the painting or anything like that is that I do wait for the entire painting to be dry to the touch before I put the varnish on. All right, and that is it. We have reached the finished product. I hoped you really enjoyed this longer form video and getting to really just dive even deeper into all the aspects of what I was thinking about and working on in this particular painting. If you really enjoyed the longer form content, please give this video a like and let me know what you most enjoyed down in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. We have really great conversations down in the comments, and I like to hear what all you all are working on and get updates on your own painting. So please say hi to me down in the chat. I would love to chat with you. And if you haven't done it already, please go ahead and subscribe. We are almost at 1,000 subscribers, which I am so excited about. And hit the bell icon so that you know anytime I post a new video. Until next time, I hope you and your families are all safe, doing well, and I wish you all happy, happy painting. Thanks for watching.